This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so the plan was for me to go through the security checklist and let me go through what I really think we should be doing today. So the OCP staff members have asked us to please resolve this because they're finalizing their 2022 templates and so forth, and they need to get moving with our decisions. In order to go through that, I'll refresh. There are some people that have not had the history, but I'll go through a quick refresher on why we even started updating the security checklist. And then I have a proposal. A few of us have been sending email back and forth trying to resolve the OCP staff members' questions, which brings up an idea for what we might do with it going forward, which answers Stuart's concern. All right. So the principal concerns so far have been, we need from Rajiv that we need to publish the supplier checklist sooner. We can't keep waiting on it. It's been a long time. And from Archana is trying to finalize the specification template for hardware. Now, this isn't the specification itself. It's the template that hardware products requesting approval by OCP, acceptance by OCP, either accepted or inspired, must present their specification following this template. And another concern that she voiced was, okay, if security as we have it now, which is just fill out the form, if security by itself is not actually required, then we shouldn't include it in the template and in the requirements for the products. All right. I'm refreshing your memory on why we had to, how we got into this, what's the state of the current checklist. So once we had the current checklist, we of course got immediate feedback from it. One was, what about these badges? Do we want, the bronze, silver, and gold? People didn't want a bronze. Vendors felt that by filling out the checklist that they were disclosing their vulnerabilities. If some vendors said we're not going to even submit our products to be approved or not because we just don't want to disclose this stuff. Others said we can't possibly meet requirements immediately. Our pipelines are at least 2 to 3 years, and including number 5, which is we can't meet the strength of the crypto now. We will in the future, and we can do some of these requirements, but we can't meet them all. There was very much uncertainty around how do we calculate whether one gets bronze, silver, or gold. What if we get everything but one bronze? Then do they not get a bronze? Do they get nothing? They would get approval, but not a badge. And 7 goes on the same vein, which is, how do we calculate what's required for the different badges? 8 is that we vendors, if we're going to put these features into our products, or at least plan for them to be in our future products, we really need these to be hard requirements, not just iffy recommendations. They need to be hard requirements. 9 was that depending on the customer, their requirements, what the device is, what the environment is, the threat model, there is no one checklist that fits all of them. And then number 10 was, hey, what about international requirements? They use different algorithms, they have different certifications, and our checklist didn't take that into account. And 11 is, okay, what are we doing with this checklist? Is it a compliance document, or is it meant just to be informative to customers? All righty. I think that was, yeah, that was a summary of them. And that, yeah, I think there was one more that's not here, which is that it sort of goes with 8 and 11 combined, which is that if it's supposed to be a compliance document, it really isn't specific enough to fit that need. Everybody with me so far?
Yes, Elaine.
Okay. All right. So you remember at the end of last year, we went through discussions about what the goals of this checklist would be. And the ones in bold here are things that we agreed on, things, the ones that are stricken from the list or ones we agreed to strike. So the goals that we have definitely agreed on is that we want to continue to raise the bar on security requirements, that the state of the world is not good enough and we need to keep raising the bar. Number 2 was that some of the features are more important than others, and we want to be sure that those are the focus, and that vendors know, for example, about the upcoming, say, quantum safe requirements, that important features that are coming. 3 is easy, identify best practices. 4 is use it where vendors can use it to identify their customers' needs now and in the future. And from the customer's point of view, number 5 is it's sort of a shopping list that when they go to vendors, they say, here is what is important to us. I'm pausing. Any questions so far? Okay, so that's what we all agreed on. What we didn't finish, I'm not going to say we disagreed because we just never finished, were that the vendor checklist, number 8, is that it could be used privately between a customer and a vendor with a non-disclosure agreement to have a discussion about what the product offers and what the customers require, both of which are private. Number 9 we struck because OCP could not get into the business of handling NDAs and that kind of stuff. It just, OCP is open and couldn't do that kind of bookkeeping. Number 10 is that this is how it is right now. This is the status quo now, is that the checklist is public, including what the vendor has completed on the checklist. So it's reported to the OCP, it's published by the OCP. It is required. There are no requirements specifically that, no compliance requirements. The only requirement is fill out the checklist, just fill it out. There's nothing within it that says you must do this or not. I mean, in order to pass. And the kind of stick here is that if the vendor, since it's a self-reported checklist, that if the vendors if they misrepresent their products or lie about them, then their recognition can be revoked for that product. Number 11 is where I wanted to talk today, which is that product specs that, maybe I just should go into it because it's easier to go through it here. So what the proposal is that for each hardware specification, so remember in OCP, a product is first preceded by a specification, after which then designs for specific products with bills of materials and power requirements and these parts, those come next. So this proposal would affect the specification up front. And in that, it is a description of a product, but not specifying every single individual part and component. You can't build it. You could build it from a design, but not from one of these specs, right? So the spec lays out the requirements. In those, what we would do is that in that specification template, which, so each, let's imagine you've got a product that, say, Meta wants to have a product that they've designed, they have the specification, and from that specification, they want vendors to come with specific designs and build them and then sell them. So in that specification, the front part of this, they would put a whole section on security, and within there, they would list their requirements for that product. So that's how we would achieve the getting things to be actually required and putting some teeth into the whole process, so that it's done through the specs, not through one galactic checklist that we try to do.
Elaine, can I ask?
Yes, please.
So I like this idea, but I'm a little confused about whose checklist whose security section hardware spec is this? This is the hardware spec for the product, or this is the customer saying, putting their hardware, publishing their hardware spec on the OCP website somewhere else?
Okay. It could be either one, because quite often, so the ones I've seen, I don't know, maybe Rajiv can answer better. The ones I've seen have been typically a combination. They've been co-authored by customers and vendors together and then put forth together as a spec. But Rajiv, maybe you can explain better.
No, I think, Elaine, you are absolutely right. It's actually both, as you stated.
So if let's just say we were putting up a product, then we would publish this spec. If our product met this spec, we would indicate that it met this spec, or we would just put this specification specifically on the checklist, or I mean in our product listing.
So in the first part, the specification, it would, let's go through one of these, for example. Let's say that we're in the generic specification. We're not in the, bits and bytes and parts list. So from this list here, that specification, this is a template, remember? So it would list any required algorithms, the modes of that for those algorithms, what strength they are and how they're used within this spec. So it would say, for example, we require elliptic curve, curve P, whatever it is, and we require it for signature verification of the firmware. And then the second part of this becomes when the actual product, you can touch it and you have the real pieces and parts list. Then it would repeat this in their design spec and say, in this product, we implement elliptic curve number, P521 and so forth.
Okay, and then you also could list any gaps or things that are where you're not compliant. I think that would be critical too. In other words, if you said, I I think it would be important if let's say I'm listing my product. Let's say I have everything on here except I don't support attestation. Then I think
Mm.
you would just omit it, or you would say attestation not supported. And then it's up to the customer and you to get together and they can decide whether or not they're like, oh, that looks really good. We wish you had an attestation, or or can and they might buy your product anyway. They might not if you don't have
Ah.
attestation.
So I have a
Because I
question
think
for.
that will in reality be the case across the board for a lot of companies, is that they're going to have a lot of these things, but very few are going to have everything.
I have a question on this topic for Rajiv, and generally speaking, this is a
Sure.
question I asked Archana as well, which is how is enforceability of this mode of reporting going to shake out when it comes to the incubation committee, right? So security is one vote, regardless of the representative, and I've noticed, things pass on a majority vote, and nobody else is looking out for this particular section of the proposal. So how do we avoid, complete, no, they just don't put it there at all.
Before you answer, I did attempt to at least list the ways that could be enforced. We still need Rajiv and Archana to respond. One is that when the spec comes out, the higher level, the generic, I'll call it the generic spec. When the generic spec comes out, if it has totally weak security requirements, like we require single DES, that it would certainly have, an embarrassment factor, and it would be publicized, right? The second option on there is we could require that prior to the incubation committee vote, that this section be presented to our security project to get more feedback on what they've put in there. The third is, and you're absolutely right, Andres, that we only have one vote, right? One security vote. But having been on those in the past, I've witnessed 2 products that got at least delayed. They were not rejected, but they were delayed because of security exposures that had to be either documented or fixed. So that's my 2 cents.
Elaine, thanks for saying that. So Andres, to your point, and I think the template that we have, the hardware template, where we have the security section, the team can provide some guidelines in terms of what those questions would be, and out of those questions, which one are mandatory, which one are acceptable, and which might be optional. Right. So as Elaine gave an example about Meta, let's say if they want to work on a solution or a product, and then I'm sure that they would like to get their thoughts in terms of what would be the security requirements, what they would like to see and what they would hope to see, and what it's more of a wish list.
So from that point, Rajiv, conversations with Ross, for example, happen. The most recent NVMe specs, they were sent to us. Hey guys, is everything here making sense? What do you want to talk about, etc. But that's all nice, right? Those are gentle people agreements, etc., etc. What we're concerned about here is somebody doesn't do any of that. They just send it to the IC. The IC just votes. Nobody else cares about this security thing, and it just moves on, and there's nothing in there. So how do we avoid that scenario?
Well, your question is valid, Andres. See, the plan that we are suggesting is just a plan. It's not a formal or a final plan, and I'm totally open to.
Okay. I just wanted to know if
No,
if there were. Okay, fine.
yeah, it's just a thought. I mean, thinking that way. I mean, as kudos to Elaine, who before presenting, she actually laid out what happened before things happened, things broke apart. So we started the journey of putting stuff, security into the template. Then we thought, let's put some information in the checklist on security, and then we worked on badging and bronze, silver, and whatnot. But then all those problems came in where people had feedback, people like security constraints, international constraints. Nobody wants to disclose their vulnerability and many of those things. So we thought, well, that security checklist for the product checklist for security may not be an option. So let's go back to the whiteboard and see what's the best way of putting some security wordings in some place, in some shape, and in some form. And I think what we concluded was, hey, let's go back from where we started and add a security section in the hardware template, and then just think through what questions might be viable to put it in there for people to at least provide some information that they think they can publicly provide. But again, this is just a proposal, and I'm totally okay if you guys have some better options in terms of what's the best way to move forward.
Okay, thank you. This might be the way we go, and this might be better than a checklist that makes people cranky and badging that makes people feel exposed. Question for you, Rajiv. What's your assessment of the way the OSF checklist is going? Because it seems parallel to this proposal.
So far, I mean, I consider the OSF checklist a little bit stable, because because they're inspired and accepted recognition marks are pretty clear. Where I mean, if they are contributing, if the customer is contributing binaries and BMC binaries, then they get inspired, but not what's the other one, inspired and accepted. But if they have to get the accepted trademark, then they need to contribute the source code. And they have some very clear questions in terms of yes and no. I don't recollect right now, but the only thing, Andres, to your point, I was hoping if they could expand their support on other devices, not just the servers per se, but also, and I know we have been debating about the definition of server, networking server, storage server, and I would have loved to have them expand their current set of supportability. But apart from that, I haven't heard much of issue, from the OSF checklist point of view.
Okay. And in terms of process errors during the IC acceptance of specs, OSF has been fine by that, right? They haven't suffered of any kind of process leaking through the cracks or anything like that.
Yes, they are. I would say they are okay. I won't say they're like great, but they're okay for the time.
Thank you, Rajiv.
And just one more thought to the team, that we are also working on redefining some of the templates, as Elaine stated, that we have a base specification and we have a design specification, but we are just trying to funnel through some of these concepts and make it more transparent to the vendors. Meaning, what do we mean by base specification? Or what are the things that goes in design specification, different versioning of design specification, then finally the product specification that combines both the base as well as the design. So again, I don't want to dilute the conversation, but today's I think conversation is more on the information that needs to be filled in the spec template, whatever it may be, and what that information would be.
So if we have this section 18, would it be in all three of those specs? It would begin life in the base and then be carried forward in the other two?
That's a great question, Elaine. And then to your point, yes. And we are trying to make this process more flexible, meaning that initially, if in the base spec, if somebody has provided information on I want you to do this, I would like to have this and that, and then when the design spec comes in, which talks more about how to do it, not what to do it, and while how to do it, they realize, oh, I wish if there had been an extra entry into the base spec that could have been better. We just have to version out a new base spec. And Elaine, as we go forward doing product specs and we realize that the vendor thinks that, oh, he can provide more than what is being captured in the spec. He knows what to do, but he just wants to modify the base spec to add those new requirements. That can also be done. We just keep track of the versioning number. So we are pretty flexible from that perspective, Elaine.
And then the monkey is on Andres's back. And well, I guess, I don't know, to check that the base spec and what comes next, the design spec, are both matching, so to speak, as far as security goes.
Fun job, but I'll do it. Yeah, no worries.
Well, at least it would be confined into one section, right? Don't have to go combing through the whole document.
Yep.
And Elaine, I like your idea about, when this, spec goes to the IC for voting, I think we may need to put this thing, what do you call, present it to the security team to get additional feedback. And it might happen that even during IC, the questions might come in about, hey, I could not do this, or I'm not comfortable, or, I have done this, but then you guys might say, you know what, we don't understand what is being mentioned in the document. Let's discuss more, and try to come up to some conclusion. So there might be a few additional things, but I think that's totally okay.
A question, is this proposal, item 18, this security section in the spec, is this in addition to the checklist with the badging, or is this a possible replacement of the checklist and badging that we discussed?
So Rob, that's a great question, and I'm glad that you said that, because this is very important. This new proposal will replace the security checklist, and this proposal will replace all the badging, security. But thinking that way, we're from 2022, where we are already in right now, there are no badges, security badges anymore, no gold, bronze, silver, because as Glenn stated, nobody wants bronze, and there are many questions, and we thought, let's put it to rest. And also, there for 2022, there are not going to be any security checklist, because I think it's putting us into a spot where there are more questions than the actual work being done. So we are actually not doing that. The only thing what we're doing starting this year on security would be to have an additional section, number 18 in the template, where we define some security requirements that we think are acceptable, optional, or whatnot. There might be some things that further needs to be discussed, as Elaine mentioned, where NIST standards are applicable to US, but some of these NIST standards are not applicable to the other parts of the world. So how the requirements, how we need to put these requirements here in, is it based on, like, are these global requirements, or if they are regional requirements? I think those are the things that I think we might need to a little bit drill down to make sure that whoever the builders are, let's say from non-US builders, should not be worried about NIST requirements, things like that. I think would be really helpful. I'm not sure if your question, but
yeah, and as far as trying to handle the different global requirements, this first draft here, section 18, has things that are required. You can see you must have if the vendor puts it in the spec, the vendor and customer will identify what the required flow is. there are these other things that are acceptable, which means there may be, let's say you want algorithm certifications, those could be international, they could be, a specific country, whatever certifications are acceptable, it has to be from among those. Sort of a list of acceptable ones that would satisfy the requirement, but there's something is still required.
So, Elaine, going back to my earlier statement, so in this scenario, what would it mean? Let's say I had a product that did not support attestation. Okay.
Mhm.
So then I wouldn't, then I fail again. I'm back to where I'm done. I can't, or do I still, am I still able to list my product? And this is just like one red line. I have, everything else is fine, but I don't support attestation, or maybe I'm going to support it in a year or something. What's the intention here of this spec? Would, if my product didn't support attestation, I would not get listed, or it would just be I would get listed on the OCP website, but it would just be noted that I don't support. I would specifically have to state I don't support attestation.
Rajiv, can you answer that one? Because I don't know.
Because we're going to be back to the same thing we were last year, where nobody's listing any products. Because
So Elaine, thanks. I think this is a good question, and uh, I mean the goal is not to be that rigid, where if you have one red line, that doesn't mean that you cannot make any decision. But I, I'm sorry, Elaine, but I'm going to throw the ball back at your court. It all depends on what you guys think. If it is a very critical thing that every product must have it, or if it is okay if there are some couple of red lines.
So if the base specification says attestation is required, it would seem to me that the product then would not get approval because it doesn't meet what the base spec does. Are there other examples, non-security related, where there's a requirement in the base spec but the product doesn't support it? What do you do then? Not forget security, just other requirements.
So based on my experience, what I have learned is, and I might be wrong, I must say that, is that if one can change the base spec, but you add more things to it, more
Add it.
requirements. Yes, add-on thing, but I have not seen a situation where you are just deleting a requirement. Like
Ah.
in the base spec you have, hey, your attestation is required, but then eventually a new version comes in, then it says attestation is not required. So that
No, but
would.
I don't think that was Elaine's question, Rajiv. It was more like, what if you have a PCIe Gen 3 device? Let's say it's a Gen 3 by 4, but the requirement for performance is a PCIe Gen 4 by 4. What do you do with that device? It doesn't meet that requirement. Do you wish the requirement away and say, please make it Gen 3? Because the device I built last year is Gen 3, not PCIe Gen 4.
Okay, absolutely, yes. I mean, those tweaks could be done. We just need to have a new updated set of the base requirement. But absolutely, the information can be tweaked. But I was more focusing on deletion part.
You see.
Yeah. And those things will happen eventually. I mean, it's not something where you write a base spec and then it's like rosy and shiny, and then it becomes a gold plate, and then everything is based on this gold plate. No, that's the reason we are we have multiple versions of the base spec where you have more enhancements, changes, tweaks to make sure that based on the questions and the feedback we get from the vendors who are trying to build, or or maybe they want their own base spec. So, but they have more open.
I think it's the opposite. I think they're saying, hey, I have products in market that don't meet these requirements. How do I make my product in market meet these new requirements? And I would say, how do you make a PCIe Gen 3 device meet a PCIe Gen 4 requirement?
I, I, I get it. I think there's a possibility. It's not that you cannot even do that, even if it's a backward process. But I think there is a way we can make those adjustments if that's what the vendor is requiring, if that's what makes sense for the adopters, and if it all makes sense for everybody.
It,
So
it's it's not a race to the bottom of the lowest common denominator for what's in market. That doesn't serve anybody.
yeah.
That's pretty useless, actually. It doesn't tell people what they need to do in their next gen product. It doesn't inform you of anything. It just tells you a little bit about history.
Mhm. Yeah.
Speaking of that, there's one other thing I wanted to present because it is relevant to what Brian just said, which is remember our old checklist, and as we were revising it, one possibility would be to take that checklist and publish it not as a checklist, but as a white paper, and use it so that customers, it's just a document to help customers tell vendors what they want and when, and vice versa. Well, I'm sorry, in procurement, it says, I want to buy this, it must meet, these requirements. So we could continue with the road we were on with trying to make a checklist that identified, I need this capability by 2022 or whatever it is. If we wanted to do that, as Brian said, to identify this is where I want to go. That's another possibility.
I like this concept, Elaine, for the white paper. If I have to do this, I will try to make it not that rigid, try to make it more flexible. That's all.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with Brian's comment about we don't want to have a race to the bottom. We want to have a race to the top. But I'm worried, I actually, I don't know. I mean, very few companies have, for example, Seagate has attestation capability on hard drive models. Most companies don't. Um, I I just feel like we're going to have the OCP marketplace is going to be barren if we throw down the hard line with with a lot of these requirements. I like the idea of it's it's really we really want to have it now, but it's going to be required in 2 years or something. That gives people something to shoot for. But either way is fine. I mean, as long as everybody agrees. But I mean, I don't feel like you're going to have anybody listing product, or very few people are going to be listing products because if it's extremely rigid. But I understand Brian's, we don't want to race to the bottom. We want to race to the top. But how do we set up a situation where we get a race to the top and not a race to the bottom? Because we definitely don't want that.
I don't think it's a race to the top. I think we want to have like a watermark on where the requirements are at. And you're either above the watermark, at the watermark, or below the watermark. And the watermark shouldn't be set at the lowest common denominator across devices that are currently in market. You're not aspiring to the goal to make your current device, your next generation device, the same or less than the previous generation device.
Agreed.
We want to up level security in the industry. So you put in the requirements that you want to see in devices. So folks need to know what to build towards. And I don't expect any current in market devices to have those capabilities. I don't expect a lot of them to check everything on the checklist. But in next generation, that's what we'd expect to see. It's devices showing up. Like already, some devices that meet all of these requirements for sure. So there will be some, but as time goes, and more devices are being built, they can use this as a guide to what to build to.
Yeah, I like the idea of the checklist as sort of a roadmap. And I do also like the idea that it gives customers or clients an ability to compare the relative security of different devices or even different systems. And and I understand, I think, a lot of the concerns that have been raised. It makes sense to me. But I'd hate to see it I'd hate to see it become so watered down that people can't use it to compare the relative security advantages of different implementations of different systems or devices. I think it gives something to strive for. And, security is sort of somewhat of an ad hoc, art, if you will, in some ways. And it tries to make it a little bit more based on, data, I guess, a little bit more rigid. Maybe it's too rigid. But I think it gives people who are not security experts an ability to do a little bit more of an apples to apples comparison than what they've had in the past, which is, nothing, right? It's really hard to do security comparisons of different solutions today, unless you're a security expert and really dig into the details. And a lot of times the details aren't even revealed, right? So, my 3 cents.
And that's a good point, Rob. Just to finishing my thought here, OCP doesn't want marketplace to be barren at all. And secondly, let's say required attestation protocols, and if a vendor just believes that they don't have it as of today, and it's a red flag, but then after discussing with the security team, they somewhat share some timeline that maybe in the next 12 months to 48 months, they will have it. And it's something that the security team needs to track it. I think, once they know that it's going to happen at some point, I think it might be an acceptable solution. I don't know. I'm just trying to make it not that rigid in these requirements.
Well, wouldn't that happen at the base spec point, not at the product? Or are you saying, well, let me rewind for a minute. When I first drafted this, and we had a little feedback, I started with required and recommended and acceptable. All three were in there. And the comment was, well, why put recommended in there? Because if this is a requirements list, then just put the requirements, black and white. Here are the requirements. If there aren't that many, well, that's fine, but just put them in black and white as requirements. But I think I'm hearing tendency to add back in recommendations, and I wanted folks to weigh in on that.
That was my thought. I think each recommendation needs some kind of property. There may be some that are inflexible and must have. There's some that might be time based, and there's some that may have some other property. But that was in my head.
I completely agree with that.
So recommendations might not be, well, we would like you to do elliptic curve P20, whatever it is. It might be by certain date, we will require elliptic curve, this curve. Oh, maybe that's the point. Maybe it's that we wish you would have an elliptic curve P521. Instead, we require that you have elliptic. It's like future requirements in this thing, in this section.
That could be one. Yeah, that could be one property. Is that it's recommended today. It must have by a certain date.
Yeah.
This could get a little bit complicated. I don't want to overcomplicate it, but if we're going to have the flexibility that allows for a populated marketplace, we're going to need that kind of additional property to the requirements. And there are some, and the bar should move with time. I agree.
Yeah, I like this idea as well.
Because at the end of the day, the customer and the vendor, if you're in really good shape, except for maybe one red line, the customers and the vendor, one part of this was to part of this whole concept was to encourage customer and vendor. Uh, this would encourage customers and vendors to drive towards a better products by working together. And ultimately, it would be the customer's decision. Say, okay, you don't have attestation. That's it's a red line. We appreciate you marking it, but it's also a red line for us. We're not buying your product. Or they can say, well, we can live with that. Like you said, Rajiv, we can live with that for a year and a half or whatever. It encourages all that dialogue and stuff.
Exactly. I think the goal is, if we get a spec from somebody and the security section is blank, that's an issue. What we're trying to do is expecting folks to put some of their thoughts in terms of what they have it, some road mapping or something with which they don't have it when they would like to accomplish this by, so that we have enough confidence that that vendor has already have good plans in terms of how to, work on those, hard requirements. I think that should be, an okay solution.
So then there'd be three categories here. We'd have requirements acceptable, which is kind of a selection of requirements, and recommendations to be met by a date. So it's not just a plain old recommendation, it's a recommendation with a date.
And
Well, I
that's
think
the date it turns into a requirement.
well,
Yeah.
there's that. There's also going to be, you're going to have a situation where you're going to deprecate requirements. And let's talk about FIPS 140. There are products that have FIPS 140-2 certification today, but good luck getting that, going forward, because you can only get FIPS 140-3 if you're not already, basically in the pipeline. At some point, you're probably going to want to deprecate anything you say about FIPS 140-2. You're not going to want it.
Yeah.
So you've got deprecated, you've got forward-looking, aspects of this, and unfortunately, from a security perspective, a lot of this falls into the crypto area, which is where we're hypersensitive about this.
And everything as far as modes and strengths and most algorithms will be deprecated, quite a bit over time, and especially
yeah.
in the next 10 years when quantum computing becomes the standard. Most everything is going to be deprecated by that point. But that would be acceptable today. Many things would be deprecated. Excuse me.
Yeah, that may not be completely true, but yeah, there's going to definitely be a hit on a lot of crypto with quantum. The asymmetric stuff is toast, but
yeah.
Eric, I understand what you're saying. I'm just wondering how to do it.
Well, look, you and I've had some back channel stuff, and I've been looking at some of the storage specs, and I have some they have struggled through this crypto stuff. So my current thought, and I guess I'm outing myself here, is that I've been chewing through crypto materials to see if there's a way to come up with a short white paper that addresses the crypto aspect of this problem, that thinking about this from a security project perspective, that we could then use with the other projects. So look, if you're going to have crypto in your specs, point at this. So and it just takes care of the crypto piece of it, and it passes the giggle test. The problem is, I think most of us on this call know, is crypto is not a trivial topic, and you got to figure out how deep you dive, and what docs, the international versus US, and how do you balance those. And so that's some of the stuff that I'm sorting through. I've been working with some folks in the Cloud Security Alliance who've also recently traversed some of this with some of their materials, and I'd hate to see us get into an incompatible scenario where if you're aligned with some of their documents that you would be misaligned here. But I'm definitely trying to come up with a contribution that would deal at least with the crypto piece, most likely the certification because it's fairly tightly bound, and then kind of offer that up, and that might help with at least some facet of this. And I'm definitely looking at the the future aspect of it. And as I mentioned, the deprecation issue, like the FIPS 140-2 has got to be flagged as something it's going to be deprecated at some point in time. And we need to be clear about that.
So Eric, are you saying that, let's say this spec, looking at this acceptable certifications of cryptographic modules, since you're talking about FIPS. So if the spec says now it has to have FIPS 140-2 or 140-3, if those are acceptable, you're saying, I think what I'm hearing you say is that at some point 140-2 is going to be, well, it already is deprecated, but it will no longer be relevant to this
Right.
spec.
Right. So, and we can probably, I mean, if you carefully look at the NIST materials and you look at the approved, certifications, they all have basically sunset dates on them.
Mhm.
So you could, in theory, look at that and reasonably predict at this point, those certifications aren't going to be relevant, even if the product's still alive. They sunset.
Yeah, but then I'm wondering who's responsible for discovering that, for example. It's already listed, it got approved today because this particular product was already in the pipeline. It got its 140-2 and it's on the OCP marketplace. Then what? So who's got to go figure out that it's no longer good?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the this is the back to the, so what does conformance mean? So it's
Oh boy.
listed today, and it could be listed, and I'm picking on the FIPS 140 angle because it's more bright line than some of this other stuff. So maybe it got listed because it had a 140-2 certification. There's no plans to do, for that vendor to do a 140-3 at the point where we deprecated, recognizing, 140-2 is, a credible certification. Yeah, do you sweep back and say, whoops, nope, you're no longer listed, or not? I don't know the answer to that. But that's kind of back to uh, the maintenance of your certification.
Respect.
Now,
Yeah.
well, one way to do that, I guess, is if we follow sort of what NIST is doing, is you could you could put a time limit on how long something sits on the website. So if you've sort of run the gauntlet and gotten listed, maybe that listing has a shelf life of 2-3 years or whatever, some arbitrary time frame, which requires a sort of reevaluation uh, at some point down the road, and that could be the trigger for how you go back and sort of reassess.
And
That's a
and
good
and
idea because it puts the onus on the submitter and not
Yeah,
OCP.
yeah, that's the only thing I can come up with, and I'm again, this is lessons learned from our friends in NIST. They used to have products that they didn't have sunsets, and those things would sit out there forever. Um, and now you get a cert and you've got basically a 5-year shelf life, which is reasonable. I mean, from a NIST perspective, those modules, they're not necessarily devices, they're modules. So those modules could get reused over a couple of generations of product. But that's about it. Maybe two generations, and then you got to go back in, to get recertified. So
So then,
I think the combination of shelf life, and if I'm even moderately successful in being able to write up at least the crypto piece with, indications of future deprecation and future adjustments, that combination might at least deal with some set of the security needs here.
so
And
we would put that shelf life here in the security section?
I think it's when a product when a decision has been made that a product is going to be listed. I would say what you do is you include as part of the listing, the expiration date of that listing, and then as that date's approaching, it behooves the vendor to basically go back and
Resubmit.
so resubmit. Yeah, I mean, you don't want to have anything that's got 2 months left on its shelf life.
So Rajiv, that would have to be something that OCB and the IC do, right?
yes, and that's a great point. Something even I didn't think through it. So in fact, we can have a logic in our marketplace where when we put some product in there, we might have some what you call expiry date. Maybe it's like 2 years, whatever it is. And then as and when we get closer to that expiry date, the tool, generates some notifications to whosoever telling them, hey, this alert has been generated because of one nest 140, maybe whatever it is coming to EOL, and it's not applicable from that day onward. So, and I think at that point the decision can be made to take it off or some other information.
Yeah,
I
I
think
think you would.
that's good, but you make it even simpler than that. I think you just say OCP products or have any any product listed on the OCP marketplace has to be resubmitted every 4 years, and period. Whether or
Right.
not it's 140-3,
Yep.
whatever.
Great idea.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That way it's super simple,
Yeah,
and it's up
and
to
the
the
other thing,
vendor.
Yep.
it's self-cleaning then, because if you've got a vendor forgot about something, they're no longer shipping it, but it's listed. It also makes us look silly, so this is a way of just keeping, at least from a security perspective, you're keeping your list current.
Okay, we've run out of time. Rajiv, what do you want? Do you want me to revise this with the comments we got today and submit it to Archana, or this section?
Yeah, I think we got a lot of feedback today, Elaine, with respect to international category, with respect to a deprecated category, with respect to optional and acceptable categories. I think that would be a very nice thing to capture, and then if you could just send it, our way, I think we can then put it into the hardware spec, and then if we have any questions, I'll reach out to you again.
Okay. All right, sounds good. Thank you everyone for such great feedback. It's really, really helpful.
It's a great call. Thank you all.
Thanks, Elaine.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Elaine.
Thanks, guys. Talk to you. Thanks, Elaine.
Bye-bye.